You know, Sonic has had a rough transition to having a history. Sonic Origins is the most recent Sonic blunder, not because of the subpar presentation, performance issues, lack of new features, or price, but because of all of those things put together. But for most people, Sonic Origins is a fine, if not downright good way to play Sonic 1, 2, 3, and CD. But it wasn't Sega's first attempt to make those games playable on a new system. A lot of people got their first taste of the Genesis Sonic games from Sonic Mega Collection, a collection of various Genesis games on the GameCube. It's mostly Sonic games, but it also has Ristar for some reason. And this collection is actually a pretty great way to play the original trilogy of Sonic games, though the bad D-pad of the GameCube controller leaves a lot to be desired. But over on the handheld side of things, Sonic was having a different experience. A lot of people were into these Sonic Advance games. They were 2D games that, for a lot of people, continued what the Genesis Sonic games started. But there was no way to play any of the original Sonic games on the Game Boy Advance. But that all changed with Sonic the Hedgehog Genesis. Oh boy. This game is considered to be not very good. The frame rate is bad more often than not, the sounds are all messed up, and even when the game runs well, the physics are terrible. Not to mention the zoomed in camera, which makes reacting to obstacles in time a nightmare. But then, on new hardware a few years later, Sonic Classic Collection for the DS. At first, that seems like a pretty solid idea. Take the Sonic trilogy, and Knuckles, put the games on the DS, and there shouldn't be any problems. All they needed to do was stick the landing, and everything would be fine. And let's start with Sonic 1, my least favorite game of the trilogy, and probably the worst running game of the bunch. Starting with the sound, it's not too bad. The Genesis has always had sound issues with emulators at this point in time, but Sonic 1 sounds pretty respectable. But then there are the graphical issues, which are less respectable. The graphics can get pretty flickery, especially in the background. It's not a big deal, but it can be a bit distracting. It happens a lot when going at high speeds, which is also when the frame rate takes a nosedive. And that's the problem with bad versions of the original Sonic trilogy. The Sonic games aren't about going fast, but they are about being able to go fast. You're supposed to master the controls, memorize the level layouts, and your reward is going fast. But when you apply that way of thinking to this version of the game, your reward is a messy frame rate. And that frame rate is pretty bad for the overall experience. How can you remember how long certain things take when the frame rate is always changing? How fast are enemy projectiles? How far can Sonic jump? How long is the invincibility? And that last one is pretty easy, just listen to the music. But this is a handheld game. I think it's reasonable to expect a game on a handheld to be playable without the sound up. One nice feature is that you can actually save the game here. Sonic 1 and 2 didn't let you save the game originally, so you had to beat both games in one sitting. Maybe they thought that was unreasonable in 2010, or maybe it's just because it's on a handheld. But being able to save the stupid game also saves me a big headache trying to beat Sonic 1, so I appreciate it. Back to the negatives, I did have the game crash on me once. It was on Green Hill Zone, and when the game crashes, the screen just slowly fades to black. The top screen, that is. The bottom screen just sat there, completely ignoring my button presses. I tried to replicate that crash, but it never happened again. Overall, Sonic 1 on this cartridge gets my stamp of playable, but not enjoyable. The frame rate is just too bad for the game to be fun. Kinda just makes Sonic 1's problems worse. It's also worth noting that for all of the games here, they chose to preserve how the games look over how they play. In order to keep everything the right size, they zoomed the camera in, making it harder to react to what's coming up. And also on the topic of how the games look, the aspect ratio is off, so everything is stretched horizontally a bit. It's fairly minor, and eventually your brain forgets that it's an issue and just starts to enjoy the adrenaline of going fast. But it annoyed me, so I'm gonna pass that annoyance off to you. But Sonic 2 is up next, and yeah, it's actually okay. The first zone has this weird missing row of pixels at the bottom of the screen, but that irons itself out almost immediately. The frame rate is a bit rough, but again, it gets better as you play the game. When the frame rate takes a nosedive, it will make things harder for you, and that's not a small problem. As mentioned before, these games need a level of consistency. When things don't go at a consistent speed, they become unpredictable, and thanks to the zoomed-in camera, you just don't get a lot of reaction time. You can't adjust to the reality of the situation when it isn't what you expect. And also I'm bad at Sonic, and I'll take every excuse I can get. Overall, I'd say Sonic 2 is playable and mostly enjoyable. It'll trip you up a few times with the bad frame rate, but you can usually recover. So that makes one bad game and one pretty solid game. Let's see the tiebreak with Sonic 3. And just like the first two games, the frame rate is pretty bad at first. But like the second game, it doesn't stay bad for very long. I will say that the sounds are pretty messed up, and the graphics can be a bit buggy at times. But this is a mostly enjoyable experience, until you get to the bonus level. This is a legitimate seizure warning that I am putting in this video. If you have issues with flashing colors, this would be a good time to look away. That being said, I will be showing the gameplay at half speed and very small. This is terrible. It's constantly flickering back and forth, and somehow the most painful part is that it sounds awful. At this point, I'd call the game unplayable. Most of the game is fine, but what they did to Blue Sphere makes beating the game 100% painful to the eyes. And the gameplay itself is hurt for it too. The first few levels are tolerable, but then things get hard when you have to time your jumps. And then I learned something interesting. Sonic Classic Collection is a DSi enhanced game. DS games that have a code starting with NTR run the same on any DS, 3DS, whatever. Games that start with TWL are either DSi exclusive games or make use of the DSi's hardware. In the case of Sonic Classic Collection, it uses the faster hardware of the DSi to make the emulation smoother. So you might be wondering, how does the game run on a DSi? About as well as you've seen. Running the game on a DS or DS Lite makes the frame rate worse, leading to Sonic 3 basically being unplayable. But Blue Sphere suddenly runs correctly, and that means it's a bad experience no matter what system you're using. I will say that the difference between the DSi and the DS Lite aren't that big, so you're probably better off just playing the game on a DS or DS Lite. And it's worth noting that every 3DS model runs the game exactly the same as a DSi as well. Overall, this compilation is decent, but I think a lot of the performance issues make it hard to recommend if you have any other method of running any of these games, except that one.